Hello and welcome to the Ecoflix Primate Podcast with pictures. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Gillian Forrester, or Gilly, as he prefers to be called. And anyone who's looked at Gilly's website will see that she is a professor of evolutionary and developmental psychology at the University of Sussex, which is quite a mouthful. And yet the picture is of you with an orange snake and a frog on sticks. So could you explain what you do every day and why it involves snakes and frogs on sticks?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here. My job has many different responsibilities to it. One is being a lecturer of students. The other is being a researcher. But I think also I find it incredibly important to use my platform for public engagement as well. So I really like to share what I find through my research, what's going on around me in the scientific community with the public. So those pictures are me going out there into the big wide world, festivals, public spaces, and just trying to interact with the public in a meaningful way so that they can gain insight into what us kind of weird and wonderful academics do in our working time.
Okay, well, try me as a member of the public with interest in particularly great apes and elephants. How does your work involve those species?
So as you said, I'm interested in evolution and development. And so I think my primary objective has always been to understand how we became the upright, walking, talking, tool-using great apes that we are today. But I'm interested in that in two perspectives. One, how that happened over evolutionary time. And the other, how does that still happen in modern humans from infancy through adulthood?
Okay. Well, we're speaking on a cold, wet, rainy day in England, and yet I read that you grew up in California. What happened? It's sunny in California. You could be in the sunshine.
Too right. Oh gosh, I know. I'm actually have got quite a mixed background. My parents were Hungarian immigrants to the UK. So they were refugees in the UK. And they had my sister, actually, she was born here in the UK, and then they emigrated to the States just before I was born. And my brother and I were both born in New York. But all the children gained UK citizenship through my parents' naturalization in the UK, which meant I always had this open door to study in England. So after I finished, we moved across country over that period of time into California. I did most of my formative growing up in California. I went to the University of California, San Diego, and studied in one of the first cognitive science undergraduate programs there, which was incredible, and decided I definitely wanted to carry on in academic research, in understanding brains and behaviors, and so applied into PhD programs. And at that point, utilized my citizenship in the UK to apply to some UK institutions, and ended up taking up a PhD at the University of Oxford. And that is where I met my husband and settled in the UK, had a family, and here I am.
Right. Well, a well-traveled academic. For people who are interested in animals because they're nice, because they're interesting, how do you go beyond that fascination, which I think many people have, and certainly the viewers of Ecoflix have? They're looking at this because they care about animals. Your studying of animals' cognition led you initially, I think, to work with captive animals. How was that? What sort of studies were you doing? This is non-invasive observational studies or experimental studies?
A real mix. I was fascinated with apes from a very young age, as long as I can remember. Pardon?
Me too.
Yeah, just incredibly fascinated. Really just had this impulse to want to see them more, to look into their eyes, to understand maybe what they were thinking. So I was always looking for an in to observe them or have an opportunity to study with them. And I received that first opportunity as an undergraduate at University of California, San Diego, but it was in a psychopharmacology lab. This was a biomedical laboratory, effectively looking at squirrel monkeys and the effects of different kinds of drugs on their cognition. This was a real eye-opener for me, and I think it really honed a lot of my future decisions about what I wanted to do and how animal research should or could be conducted.
Yeah, it must be quite uncomfortable for.
Incredibly uncomfortable. I wouldn't participate in any of the invasive work, but what I asked if I could do would be to observe their colony of squirrel monkeys and write a report up and collect data on their social behaviors and their hierarchical statuses. These animals already had an invasive implant to record from specific cells within the brain. So they were effectively plugged in, and you could look at the EEG, the neural responses of small clusters of cells in their brains as they were shown different stimuli. So that was something that had already been conducted, and then these animals were going to be lifelong lab animals. So it was a massive eye opener, I have to say, and like I said, it did definitely inform my future decisions. And then I went on to study a PhD in human neuroscience, experimental psychology at Oxford. And there I learned all about the brain, how the brain works, different bits that light up when you do different kinds of things, imaging with magnetic resonance imaging with positron emission tomography, also looking at the speed of messages sent through the brain using electrophysiology. So I had this incredible exposure to all these different methodologies that help us understand the functions of the brain. But I have to say, I wasn't totally satisfied, because even though you can see how brains work, for me, the behaviors are just as important, and the naturalistic behaviors seem almost, for me, more important than the behaviors we could see in a laboratory.
That's working with willing volunteers, humans whose consent to be observed while the brain is working. How did that then move on to puzzle boxes and environmental enrichment for apes?
So I never gave up the desire to work with apes, but a grounding in human neuroscience was a really good way for me to understand how brains work and how behaviors manifest based on brain function. And so I thought, if I can now come back to working with apes or comparative work with humans and apes, I'd have a unique understanding, a unique background from which to come and observe their behaviors. So I took some time out to have a family. And when I came back, I decided this was the good time to make this proper switch of gears. And I wrote a fellowship application to a wonderful trust called the Daphne Jackson Trust, who helps individuals who've taken a break for family and caring responsibilities to come back into academia with a good balance. So they give you kind of half-time postdoctoral contracts. And they accepted my proposal to work with a group of apes in the UK in captivity and study their communication behaviors. And that's what kicked off the last kind of almost 20 years of research with apes.
Gosh. And I have to ask, were your children study animals too? Did you observe your children from a cognitive development point of view?
There's no escape for children born into families of psychology researchers.
That's what I thought. Yes.
I always joke with my family. I said, we can save for university or therapy, your choice.
Okay. So what really excited me when I heard about your recent work is this opportunity you had to study apes who had grown up in captivity, learning how to be an ape in the wild, in the natural habitat, and that idea of seeing the same individual who you'd worked with in a captive setting becoming a free living autonomous being in his or her natural habitat. Can you just explain how that came about and what it felt like?
Yeah, so this is all really new. The research that you're speaking about is kind of the up and coming new line of work that I'm interested in pursuing. It came about because I had designed a study to look at the evolution of language in humans. And one of the prevailing theories is that the way that we use our hands to solve problems is incredibly important and was incredibly important as ancient humans and going back through our shared evolutionary history with great apes. The bit of the brain that helps you solve problems with your hands and use tools is highly overlapping with the bit of the brain that we use for language in modern humans. But it's really hard to find evidence and create evidence that theory is true and gain support for it. And so these puzzle boxes that we developed actually mimic language structure. The aim of them was to create these puzzles where each section of the puzzle kind of represented a different structure in language. And then when you put all these structures together, you have like a sentence. And so it kind of represents the syntax that we have in language. So if you have to do something in a specific order to get the correct meaning out or answer out or get the nut out of the box, then you can represent this kind of structure syntax that we have in language. And we think it's the same structure syntax that we use when we are using our hands to solve problems. So this was a project where we could take the same stimuli, the same puzzle boxes, and give them to apes, but also give them to children, and see whether or not they were solving them at the same kind of complexity levels. And also with the children, did the ability to solve these problems match their language learning capabilities so that we could validate whether or not we were actually tapping a language syntax kind of process. And what we found was like all the apes, well, first of all, they were incredibly interested in these boxes. We looked at not bonobos yet, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans in captivity in the UK. And they were all incredibly interested. And just like with humans, there's massive variability in their ability levels. But there were some individuals in every species who could solve the most complex problems. And so we were fascinated by this, and it was a really lovely thing to see. And it does suggest that we inherited this ability to solve problems with our hands, which then somehow moved to an internal process of language for humans.
So much of communication is non-verbal and involves gestures and facial expressions and direction of gaze and all these things, which for anyone who's had the opportunity to spend time with apes in the natural habitat is a big part of their interaction. And yet it's very hard to see that as language. It's communication. And, even other social mammals, dogs, their eyebrows are very expressive, their faces, their gesture, posture conveys, the play bow. I want to play with you. You see a dog doing that, and immediately you understand. And if you replicate it, I saw a lovely bit of video of a polar bear approaching a husky dog on a chain. And rather than attacking the dog and the dog running away, the dog immediately did a play bow, and the bear understood and played with the dog. So if you're ever in a position where you're being approached by a potential dangerous predator, try offering to play with it in a gestural way. Maybe it'll just defuse the situation, which goes from predator prey to interested other organism that I could interact with. So these interspecies communications are fascinating. And of course, with apes, throughout the 60s and 70s, right up to quite recently, the ape language studies involved teaching young apes sign language. which immediately fits in with your idea that it's the use of the hands to produce gestures that taps into that cognitive ability to communicate. So did you think about the sign language opportunity?
Yes, you bring up two great points. So one is your brain doesn't care if you're speaking with your mouth or your hands. It's the same bit of your brain that is doing those computations. So we could call languages like it's amodal. It doesn't care what the channel is. Just as you've said, apes and other animals seem to gesture more, and that seems to be their natural communication style, even more than vocalization. So just because we speak now doesn't mean that that was the origin of our language story. And in fact, it probably wasn't, which was, I think, growing up, these ape language studies, which I was fascinated by, I was always super confused by them as well, because I didn't understand why we were trying to teach apes our language when we could be learning their language.
Well, interestingly, the Gorilla Foundation has made that transition from after the sad demise of Coco. They're now looking at gestural communication in naturally behaving, whether it's captive or in the wild, gorillas, because I think there's much to learn there. And having spent time with gorillas,
and it's exactly what even exactly. And it's what the literature proposes too, is that the studies indicate that it's more likely to have been a gestural origin anyway for ancient humans. And it just begs the question of why we've been focusing so much on vocal language, but also on human language specifically, instead of looking at.
Let's face it, we're very egocentric as a species, anthropocentric. If it's to do with humans, we're really interested. If it's to do with other species, less so, unless there's some reason that brings them into our sphere. And
I think it's been quite divisive in a lot of ways, and the comparative cognition doesn't have the shiniest past, because it's always used humans as a reference point for what is typical or normal, or what is the most sophisticated and pinnacle of sort of communication processes. But all it's actually done is force us to make direct comparisons between us and other animals, and then draw a line between us saying, this is human unique and this is not. And I think actually that has inhibited us from progressing and moving forward and understanding what our connections are and what the evolutionary precursors might have been to what our capabilities are today, because they didn't emerge out of nowhere spontaneously. They have an old evolutionary story.
They do, but there must be a lot of convergent evolution, because I'm thinking of the success of My Octopus Teacher. Cephalopods, octopus, squid, very different evolution, and yet they seem to respond to some human activities which suggest that you can have a relationship, whether it's a friendship or just mutual curiosity. But the very fact that an invertebrate can be curious about a human and not see it as either a threat or a food item, just another organism, and then they're communicating with each other, that kind of blows my mind.
It is cool, and it's amazing to see how people who spend so much time with individual species actually get a far more holistic understanding of the way that they operate and the way they communicate. But you have to have that really intensive observational periods to understand that. And that's one of the things that we've been thinking about with the research going forward. So I told you about the puzzle boxes, but one of the outcomes of the puzzle boxes wasn't the evolution of language results. It was more interesting to see that actually they sat there engaged with it, and allowed us to watch their behavior even more intensely than we had previously. And talk to all the keepers and the people who work with these animals on a daily basis. And one of the things that was so revealing was that there's so much information about animal behavior out there that's held by the keepers and sanctuary staff and conservationists that is not published. So researchers might go in with a preconceived notion of what apes can do, what abilities they have and don't have in different settings. And then you talk to the people who are with them every day, and they're like, no, they can do this, they can do that. It's common knowledge. We all know it. And I am always just completely blown away by how much information us researchers are missing by not having an intimate relationship and building and developing research with the teams who are on the ground.
Yeah, that brings to mind a story. Let me share with you. At Limbe, a sanctuary for apes and other primates in Cameroon, and I was visiting and filming, and one of the gorillas got a stick and used it to bring a watering can from the other side of the electric fence close to the electric fence so he could reach under and grab the watering can. And the keeper rescued the watering can just before and said, oh no, I wanted to film that because this is an ape using a tool. And apes, gorillas are less well known for tool use, let's say. So he reluctantly let me film the gorilla finish the job of using a stick to get the watering can. And then the gorilla played with the watering can, went over to the water fountain, which had a little trickle, and deliberately filled the watering can and drank from the watering can just for fun.
Wow.
And then the keeper said, well, but now eventually the watering can is going to be destroyed, be chewed up and so on. I said, well, let's get it back. Have you got some bananas? And this keeper, although he knew that the gorillas could use tools to get things that they shouldn't have from the human perspective, didn't realize that you could negotiate with them.
The bartering
got the gorilla's attention, still holding the watering can, with a banana. And I offered him the banana, and she wanted to reach to get it through the electric fence. And I said, I gestured at the watering can, not interested. Up the stakes, more bananas. Eventually, I got to the point that the gorilla agreed to return the watering can and went off with the bananas. And the keeper's face was, he was gobsmacked. Okay, that's a real negotiation. And the gorilla, for the first time, was put in that situation of understanding that, I mean, the gorilla knew that she had something that she shouldn't have, that the humans didn't want her to have. But the lure of a big bunch of bananas was enough that she would relinquish the watering can. And I think both gorilla and keeper learned a lesson there. And I thought it was fascinating that's possible, and that you can have.
And you point out again one of these aspects of behavior that I'm fascinated with, which I call ability versus capability. And so ability is what you're going to express in your everyday environment based on the social and kind of physical pressures that are around you. But it doesn't mean you're not flexible, and those can't change given changes in those physical and social pressures. So what you're describing is this ape absolutely had the capability to barter and understand that bartering process, but they were never triggered to have those behaviors and exhibit them before because you weren't there offering them the bananas. But when you were offering them the bananas, they could do that. They had that skill set. And so I get frustrated too by the researchers that there's kind of this bias towards what is a natural behavior. And if you see apes doing something in captivity, it may not be a natural ape behavior because they've learned it from humans or there are different pressures. And I just think, no, this is about flexibility, adaptability. If the ape can perform that behavior, that means they had the capability. If the pressures are there, they will perform that behavior. And I just think we miss again so much by drawing this line between what we think is real and what is not.
Or sometimes perhaps if they've seen tool use by humans and they have a chance to try it out, but it's observing humans doing it that perhaps set the example. And there were certainly examples of that at Limbe, where there was a lot of construction of bigger enclosures for these are orphaned apes rescued from the bushmeat trade or from the pet trade, and being given ultimately that the aim is to put them into natural habitat. But at the moment they're in large naturalistic enclosures. But they do see a lot of human activity around them. and I again filmed a gorilla playing with a bit of metal pipe and sort of enjoying the cold feel against the skin, turning it over, using it inventively. I'm fascinated by inventive play, and often that is triggered by the example of someone else doing it, so that becomes like cultural transmission. You see someone else try it yourself.
Yeah, but that's not different really from children learning from watching parents. Okay, so humans, we make this distinction that we teach. I've also seen teaching in apes, but that's beside the point. But the children also learn by practicing and observing what other humans are doing, and if those objects are provided for them, they become natural little scientists, right? And they're curious and they want to test things out, and that's what they do. And that's, I think, exactly what we see in other great ape species as well.
Yes, I have of gorillas exhibiting behavior that I would use to describe them as naturalists. That is, curiosity with another life form, looking with interest and not predatory intent at chameleons or baby birds or even antelope. Or I can tell you some great stories about gorillas, mountain gorillas in their natural habitat, being fascinated by other species. Particularly like with elephants, if they haven't seen them for a long time, and there are sadly, so few forest elephants in the Virunga volcanoes today, that young gorillas are likely to grow up not seeing them. And then when they see them, they're like, what is that? They're climbing trees, they're looking, they're fascinated by this other creature. Yes. So much to learn.
Yeah, and
obviously humans
been in the forest. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, we obviously are apes, so it shouldn't greatly surprise us that other apes who happen to be a different species share many of our cognitive abilities. But where is your research going now? I was interested in this idea that individuals who you'd studied in captivity in England are now being given the opportunity of a life in the wild with the Aspinall Foundation. I want to drill into what your experience was. Here's someone you're dealing with in captivity behind a cage. It's a zoo gorilla. And then he's in a rehabilitation program in natural habitat in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, it was the most incredible experience to have that opportunity to see apes that I worked with in my postdoc days. So this was quite a long time ago, where there was a whole family of Western lowland gorillas that were housed by the John Aspinall Foundation at Portland Wild Animal Park. It's a group of about 12. The silverback was called Jala, and a beautiful biological family. And they had an opportunity to do an experimental release, which was the first time that they put they moved an entire family out to their reserve in Congo. Gabon, to Bateki Plateau in Gabon. The whole family moved out. They keep them on a pre-release island for about a year so that they can get them used to the natural foods on the island and slowly decrease the amount of provision that they're giving them. And so this is now many years later. One of the children of that group has just fathered the first wild-born baby to two captive born adults. So he met a French sweetheart who came over from a French zoo. And our job was to go over recently and see how this little family of three are doing and whether or not we could observe their preparedness for full release to the wild reserve. But we also got to see the father, the old silverback, who's still hanging around. And he's 40 years old now. He's a solitary male. And I knew him best because his son, who's had the new baby now, was just a very small child when I saw them last. But Jala the silverback, the change in his physicality was probably the most striking. I didn't realize how big silverbacks in the wild and their musculature changes, and just how incredible they look in the wild. So there was this incredible shift from this silverback, who I thought had been impressive looking in the wild, but had some nervous hair loss, where he had plucked hair from his arm. Maybe just his coat wasn't as shiny, and he wasn't as big. Now seeing him in the wild, he was still having a bit of food provision because he's quite old, but just looked phenomenal and looked in his element, and his hair had all grown back and he looked glossy and beautiful. Wow. I couldn't have asked for a better experience. It was incredible.
Did you get the sense that he recognized you?
It's difficult to say. We're in a boat just off the river's edge, and needing to be incredibly careful about transmission of any bacteria or virus. So we were all masked up, so he could only see my eyes. I like to think he knew who I was. I said hello, and I have a distinctive American voice. He might have recognized my voice. But it was enough for me just to see him there in that place where he belongs.
That is a very powerful image. And I hope, my work at the moment is focusing very much on the role that these animals play in the forest and how they enhance the forest's ability to flourish because of the way they prune the trees and fertilize the soils with their dung, as well as dispersing seeds. And that our previous attitude has been, well, they're interesting scientifically because we'd like to learn about them, or they're interesting to look at. So people come on holidays or they go to a zoo as if their value is ornamental, a nice ornament to look at. And when you see them in their natural habitat being part of that ecosystem, and it turns out elephants and other large animals and by extrapolation, a family of 20 to 30 gorillas probably equals in terms of biomass one elephant. Their impact on the forest is to increase the ability of the forest to provide the ecosystem services like carbon capture and storage, rainfall production that we now value. So they really have an important role to play, and the idea that apes from captivity, even those born in captivity, could be given the opportunity to go and be the gardeners of the forest and flourish and look more impressive there than they did in that captive setting is I think a very attractive one. And I think as our attempts to prevent dangerous climate change and restore nature, the UN called this the decade of ecosystem restoration. And what could be more satisfying than putting apes from captive settings into habitat which has been depleted of apes, providing that you've got the communities that were previously hunting apes on side to putting them back and rebuilding those ecosystems. So you were encouraged that their cognitive abilities could cope with that kind of change.
I am encouraged, but this is exactly where the research is now going. So what we recognized when we did the puzzles study is that we could take some biometric readings of apes that would allow us to understand their stress levels. And so what I'd like to do is take this opportunity to really turn the tables. We've used apes to understand humans for decades, right? Whether it's anatomical, physiological, brain function, medications, disease. We've used them to service ourselves and our own quality of life. And now I think we really need to look at ourselves and pay back. And so if we understand how our brain, that our brain functions are so similar, then my idea is that we know that we can be physically stressed as humans, and that can be manifested in, let's say, a rise in our skin temperature and our breathing rate and our heart rate. That will all change. But we now know as humans that we can also be psychologically stressed, and it also has an impact on our breathing rate and our heart rate and our skin temperature. And so what I want to do is use humans as a model to see if we can start to evaluate the psychological stress of apes, so that if we are moving apes from one situation to another, say a captive environment to a pre-release program, or maybe we're trying to integrate individuals into stable groups for release, or maybe we want to just monitor them pre and post-release, then if we can take these kind of biometric measures of their stress levels to better understand the apes who are able to self-regulate well, because we do know that humans who regulate well and can bring their heart rates back down quickly after a stressful event, or it doesn't go as high as as other individuals, then we'll gain an understanding of who might be viable candidates for release, who might thrive in a wild setting more easily. And then for those who we think can learn those skills, maybe we can build some interventions into their captive settings pre-release, so that we can make them more ready for a wild experience.
Yeah.
So this is where I'd like to go with this kind of research. And this is, again, working with conservationists, working with researchers, working with the keepers and the sanctuary staff and the team on the ground with the animals every day to build these measures and structures up, so that we can use them together to repopulate the forests in an effort to stem the decline of these ape populations in the wild.
Wonderful, groundbreaking work, and I thank you very much for sharing those insights. I'm going to wrap it up now, but it is a real pleasure to swap stories and ideas with you, and I look forward to seeing how this new research project pans out,
Me too.
and the reaction of the zoo community, who are being basically challenged. Okay, you've been an ARC all this time, let's put some of them back, and this is how best to prepare for them. So Professor Gilly, thank you so much for joining us on Ecoflix, and tell us all about it when the next stage is complete.
Thank you for having me.